So Politico.com is out. You can see my marked up version of it. This is what happens to news articles when they come out and I can't believe them. What? Politico.com out with this jaw-dropping scoop tonight about a previously undisclosed congressional investigation into the U.S. military apparently diverting C-17 cargo flights to stop at President Trump's golf course in Scotland. Literally to have U.S. airmen stay at his golf resort so that revenue from that goes to President Trump, but also having the C-17s fuel up at commercial rates at a struggling nearby airport that Trump needs to stay open if he's going to keep that golf course open. These flights, these routine flights from Elmendorf Air Base in Alaska back and forth to Kuwait, these supply trips, they always previously refueled at U.S. military bases, which makes sense. They are military flights. But now apparently Congress is investigating the fact that in the Trump era, they've been refueling at Trump's struggling Scottish golf course, stopping there both directions to and from Kuwait. Just astonishing. So this is our life now, right? We get this stream of stories every day now, some more astonishing than others, about the president using his office for his own personal gain, using it to line his pockets, using it to prop up some of the worst performing parts of his business empire. Here's another story along those same lines, but it's the sort of darker iteration of it. It is one thing to use the powers of the presidency to direct taxpayer money into your own pocket. It is an even darker plot to use the powers of the presidency like this. This is a story that was broken, interestingly, today on the editorial page of the Washington Post. Last night on this program, we talked with California Congressman John Garamendi about how the Trump administration is raiding U.S. military funds and defunding a whole bunch of projects for U.S. troops and for the U.S. Armed Forces to instead divert that money to build his border wall. And that poses all sorts of problems for the president, right? I mean, politically, it's a problem in terms of his self-proclaimed support for the military as he takes their funds. It's going to cause him political problems and serious discontent and complaint all around the country where military projects that were promised, including things like elementary schools and daycare centers for the kids of U.S. troops, those things have been promised to U.S. troops and their families. They've been funded by Congress. They've been approved and they're ready to go. Trump is now taking them away because he's taking that money for his own purposes. That's going to be trouble for him. The plan is also going to cause the president some legal trouble, which is a lot of what we talked to Congressman Garamendi about last night. But there is also a specific problem, a specific plot in the way that Trump is raiding money from the U.S. military overseas. A strikingly large portion of the overseas stuff that Trump is defunding in order to build the wall instead are projects that come under the heading of something called the European Deterrence Initiative or the European Reassurance Initiative. It's the same program, but it's had those two different names. And this is something that was set up by the U.S. government to help our NATO allies that are being threatened by Russia. It was set up basically as pushback against Russian pressure on our NATO allies after Russia invaded Ukraine and took part of that country and started a war in the eastern part of that country. I mean, that program to push back on Russia, that's the stuff that Trump is rescinding funding for overseas. And that, of course, is a great gift to Russia. And it's a very hard thing, I assume, for the Trump administration to defend, which is why they're doing it without saying that's what they're doing. One of the things we talked about last night is that specifically targeted military funding that Trump is taking away, that supposed bulwark against Russia that Trump is taking away, that is one of four things that the U.S. government did to try to push back on Russia after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, took part of that country for itself, and started a war there. The U.S. set up this European initiative, the European Reassurance Initiative, which Trump is now defunding. Also, in addition to that, the U.S. took the lead in kicking Putin and Russia out of the G8. So the group of 8 countries would instead become the group of 7 countries because Russia was kicked out over what they did to Ukraine. Both of those things, the European Reassurance Initiative and kicking Putin out of the G8, Trump is trying to undo both of those things, right? In addition, third thing the U.S. did, the U.S. led the Western world in instituting harsh sanctions against Russia. And we know the Trump administration and the Trump transition all the way back to the Trump campaign. They've been scheming quite aggressively to try to undermine or even unilaterally reverse those sanctions. So you look at all the things the U.S. government did to try to push Russia back after it invaded this neighboring country, Ukraine. Trump has tried to undo them all. He's right now trying to undo that funding for military projects in Europe. He is trying to undo Putin getting kicked out of the G7. He has long been trying to undo the sanctions against Putin and Russia. And there's one other thing. There's a fourth thing that the U.S. did in response to Putin invading Ukraine and taking part of that country for itself. I mentioned it last night. We didn't talk about it in detail. The fourth one of those things that the U.S. government did that Trump is now apparently trying to undo is that after Russia invaded Ukraine and took part of that country and started waging this ongoing war there, this ongoing occupation effort in another part of Ukraine, the fourth thing the U.S. government did in response to that, in addition to sanctions, the G7, and the European military projects, the other thing we did was the U.S. government started giving a whole bunch of assistance to Ukraine, aid to Ukraine to help them push back against Russia. And I mentioned last night that President Trump is also trying to take that away. He has put on hold U.S. assistance, including military assistance to Ukraine this year. He said that funding, that assistance to Ukraine, has to be reviewed. Well, the Pentagon apparently reviewed it and decided it's fine, it checks out, we should give him that money. But Trump still won't release it against the Pentagon's wishes. If he doesn't release that aid to Ukraine by the end of the month, it goes away. Ukraine won't get it at all. Well, now, tonight, what the Washington Post is reporting is that aid to Ukraine that's being withheld by the Trump administration, it's not just being withheld by Trump as a favor to Putin, which it is, but according to the Washington Post tonight, Trump is also holding back those hundreds of millions of dollars for Ukraine for another very specific purpose. Quote, Mr. Trump has suspended the delivery of $250 million in U.S. military aid to Ukraine, a country still fighting Russian aggression in its eastern provinces. Some suspect Mr. Trump is once again catering to Mr. Putin, who is dedicated to undermining Ukrainian democracy and independence. But, says the Washington Post, but we are reliably told that the president has a second and more venal agenda. He is attempting to force the new leader of Ukraine to intervene in the 2020 U.S. presidential election by launching an investigation of the leading Democratic presidential candidate, Joe Biden. What? Mr. Trump is not just soliciting Ukraine's help with his presidential campaign, he is using U.S. military aid that country desperately needs in an attempt to extort it. News tonight is bananas. I mean, we have known that President Trump is holding up this aid to Ukraine. We have known that that is dodgy, right? Given how much of a favor that is to Vladimir Putin and Russia. And given that the president is contradicting the Pentagon and insisting on holding back that money, given that the Trump administration hasn't said anything about the fact that they're doing this, they just hope no one will notice, it's been pretty obvious that something dodgy and worrying is going on here. But if the Washington Post is right, that Ukraine is not getting its military aid unless they do something to try to hurt Joe Biden's presidential campaign? They're trying to get Ukraine to help Trump beat Joe Biden, his expected rival for the 2020 presidential campaign. They want Ukraine's help with that. They want Ukraine to cook something up against Biden, or they don't get their money. I mean, if that's really what's going on here, I honestly am going to walk out of this movie. And although this is being newly asserted by the Washington Post editorial board, there's actually a whole lot of reporting that bolsters every part of this case. And we've got more on that, including some expert help to try to figure it out coming up. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.